You are standing still. You are waiting. You are not pushing forward, even though you want to move. You are standing in a line. It feels normal. It feels automatic. It feels polite. Yet this quiet act has a long and surprisingly strict history that stretches back into medieval streets, thick with mud voices and rules that govern nearly every movement of daily life. In the medieval world, order was not optional. It was survival. Towns were crowded. Resources were limited. Authority was visible and physical. When people gathered, they were expected to do so in a controlled way, or risk punishment, suspicion, or worse. Lining up was not a courtesy. It was a rule enforced by social pressure, religious teaching, and sometimes the blunt presence of guards. You can imagine a medieval market morning, just after sunrise. The bell has rung. The gates are open. People arrive early, not out of eagerness but necessity. Bread, meat, cloth, and grain may not last. Those who arrive late may go hungry. Yet even here you would not see a chaotic rush in every place. In many towns you would see something familiar. People waiting. People holding their place. People watching closely to make sure no one steps ahead. This behavior was not universal across all medieval Europe, but where it existed, it was deeply connected to ideas of fairness, sin, and communal stability. Christian teaching emphasized order, humility, and patience. To push ahead was not merely rude, it was morally suspect. It suggested greed, pride, and disregard for the community. Priests preached about proper conduct, not only in church but in daily transactions. Waiting calmly became a visible sign of inner discipline. Local laws reinforced this behavior. Town charters often included detailed rules about markets, where you could stand, when you could approach the stall, who was served first. Widows, or the elderly, sometimes had priority. Bakers were required to sell in order of arrival. Violating these rules could lead to fines, public reprimand, or temporary exclusion from the market. You are not just watching people wait, you are watching a system designed to reduce violence. In crowded spaces, medieval life was always one insult away from a fight. Knives were common tools. Tempers were short. A simple disagreement over bread could become deadly. Orderly waiting reduced flashpoints. It slowed interactions. It forced eye contact, accountability, and restraint. The same rules applied beyond markets. Wells were central gathering points. Water was essential and limited. Lines formed not because it was pleasant, but because chaos around a well could cripple a household. Town officials sometimes appointed a well keeper to enforce order. Everyone knew their place. Children learned early where they belonged. Stepping out of line was remembered. In churches, the idea of lining up took on spiritual meaning. Communion required order. Confession required waiting. Pilgrims queued for relics believed to heal or forgive sins. These lines could stretch for hours or days. To endure patiently was itself an act of devotion. Complaints were seen as weakness of faith. Even punishment followed orderly patterns. Public penalties were administered in sequence. The condemned waited their turn. Spectators stood where assigned. Disorder during punishment was itself punishable. Authority was maintained through visible structure. You might think medieval people lacked personal freedom, but they understood something very clearly: without order, the powerful always move first. Rules about waiting protected the weak in subtle ways. A peasant standing behind a noble could point to the rule. The rule was older than both of them. Breaking it carried social consequences. This obsession with order also reflected medieval ideas about the universe. God created a hierarchy: angels, kings, nobles, peasants, animals, plants, everything had a place. To stand patiently was to accept this cosmic arrangement. To push forward was to challenge it. That was dangerous not only socially but spiritually. Over time, these habits hardened into custom. Children watched adults wait. They copied them. No one explained the reasoning anymore. It simply became how things were done. Even when laws faded, the behavior remained. It was reinforced through shame, praise, and repetition. As centuries passed, markets modernized and authority softened. Yet, the habit survived. You still feel uncomfortable cutting ahead, even when no one stops you. You still glance back to confirm your place. You still feel irritation when someone ignores the invisible order. You are carrying medieval discipline in your body without knowing it. The line is not just a convenience. It is a quiet echo of fear, fairness, faith, and survival. It asks you to wait even when no one is watching. And yet not every medieval society embraced this rule equally. Some places favored status over order. Others relied on force instead of patience. So why did this particular habit endure while so many others vanished? And what happened when medieval order was challenged by growing cities and new ideas of equality? As towns grew larger in the later medieval centuries, the simple act of waiting became more complicated. You are no longer standing in a small village where everyone knows your name, your family, and your habits. You are now surrounded by strangers. People arrive from other regions, languages mix, customs clash, trust weakens. In this crowded, unfamiliar world, order must be enforced more carefully, or it will disappear. Medieval authorities understood this problem very well. Growth brought opportunity, but also danger. A market that once served a few hundred people might now serve several thousand, without shared memory and mutual recognition. The quiet pressure that once kept people in line no longer worked. This is when waiting stopped being only a habit and became a visible rule backed by authority. Town councils across Europe issued ordinances that spelled out how people were expected to behave in public spaces. These documents survive in archives, and they are remarkably detailed. They describe where buyers must stand, how close they may approach a stall, and when they may speak. They describe who must wait and who may pass. Bakers, butchers, fishmongers, and cloth sellers were all subject to different rules, but the principle was the same. No rushing, no crowding, no pushing forward. You would notice that these rules often appeared after moments of crisis. A food shortage, a riot, a fight that ended in death. Disorder left scars, and those scars became law. The line became a tool of prevention. It slowed people down when emotions ran high. It created witnesses. It made every action public. Waiting also became tied to ideas of legal fairness. Medieval courts did not operate quickly. You waited days, weeks, or months for judgment. People learned that patience was a civic virtue. Those who demanded immediate satisfaction were viewed with suspicion. Waiting showed respect for process and authority. This attitude spilled into daily life. The person who waited calmly was seen as reliable and trustworthy. Guilds played a major role in reinforcing these behaviors. Craftsmen depended on order to protect their livelihoods. When customers arrived, guild members wanted predictable systems. They did not want shouting matches or sudden surges that favored the strongest voice. Lines protected reputation and stability. A guild that allowed chaos risked losing the trust of the town. You can imagine a medieval baker watching a line form before dawn. Each person represents a transaction. Each transaction represents survival. If the baker ignores the line, he risks accusations of favoritism. Favoritism leads to resentment. Resentment leads to violence. The line is safer than choice. Even monasteries enforced strict order in waiting. Monks lived by schedules measured not by clocks but by bells and routine. Meals, prayer work, and rest followed fixed sequences. To break order was to break discipline. Lay people who visited monasteries absorbed these habits. They saw waiting as calm, purposeful, and holy. Children were trained early. Parents corrected them publicly if they stepped ahead. Shame was a powerful teacher. To be seen as unruly marked you and your family. In tight communities, reputation mattered more than comfort. Waiting was uncomfortable, but disorder was dangerous. Yet it is important to notice who benefited most from these rules. Order did not mean equality. Status still mattered. Nobles, clergy, and officials often bypassed lines. Their exemption reinforced hierarchy. Waiting taught ordinary people patience but also obedience. This dual purpose made the rule durable. It served peace while preserving power. As cities expanded in the late medieval period, new spaces demanded new forms of order. Bridges, gates, and ferries became choke points. People waited to cross rivers. People waited to enter cities before curfew. Guards enforced sequence. You crossed when allowed. You learned to wait, or you were turned away. The Black Death reshaped these habits in subtle ways. After massive population loss, labor became more valuable. Workers gained leverage. Markets changed. But fear of disorder increased. Scarcity made tempers sharper. Authorities doubled down on visible control. Waiting became stricter, not looser. Lines were monitored. Punishments for disorder increased. You might expect that as medieval society moved toward the early modern period, these habits would fade. Instead, they adapted. As printed notices and signs appeared, they reinforced waiting rules. Written instruction replaced spoken correction. The line became formalized. It no longer relied only on memory or observation. By the time early modern states emerged, waiting had become embedded in civic identity. To wait your turn was to belong. Foreigners were often marked by their impatience. Travelers wrote about orderly or disorderly towns as a measure of civilization. Waiting quietly became a sign of moral character. You can feel this inheritance even now. When someone ignores the line, you feel more than inconvenience. You feel offense. You feel that something shared has been violated. That reaction is older than modern politeness. It is rooted in centuries of training, fear, and social memory. But this habit was never without tension. People resisted it when desperate, hunger, illness, and injustice still broke lines apart. Riots still erupted. The line held until it did not. When it broke, the consequences were remembered for generations. So the medieval obsession with order did not create a perfect system. It created a fragile one that required constant reinforcement. Waiting was calm on the surface, but beneath it lay anxiety, scarcity, and the threat of force. And as new ideas about equality and individual rights began to appear, these old rules faced quiet challenges. If everyone is equal, why should some wait and others pass? If time is valuable, why should patience be demanded? Those questions did not disappear. They followed the line into the modern world, where it would be reshaped again under new pressures and new ideals. By the time medieval habits of waiting reached the threshold of the modern world, they were so deeply embedded that few people recognized them as rules at all. You no longer needed a guard, a priest, or a guild officer to tell you where to stand. Your body already knew. Your eyes measured distance. Your sense of fairness activated before reason. You stood still and waited because doing otherwise felt wrong, even when no one could explain why. As centralized states grew stronger, they quietly absorbed medieval order rather than replacing it. Bureaucracy thrived on waiting. Taxes, petitions, licenses, and permissions all required standing in sequence. The medieval line moved indoors. It became corridors, counters, benches, and later desks. Authority no longer needed to shout. It simply required patience. You can trace this transition in surviving records. Early modern city halls kept logs of complaints about people skipping ahead. These complaints were not framed as inconveniences, but as moral failures. The offender was described as aggressive, dishonest, or untrustworthy. The language echoes medieval sermons more than legal codes. Industrialization intensified the habit. Factories required timing, coordination, and predictability. Workers lined up for wages, rations, and assignments. Trains required boarding order. Tickets formalized sequence. Waiting became mechanical, but the emotional expectation remained medieval. You wait, because that is how things function, without collapse. Even revolutions did not erase the line. During periods of upheaval, people still queued for bread, information, and safety. When governments fell, lines often grew longer, not shorter. Waiting became a sign that society still existed at some level. A line meant structure had not completely dissolved. You might notice that moments of crisis reveal how fragile this habit truly is. When fear overwhelms trust, lines break down quickly. Yet as soon as stability returns, people reform them almost instinctively. This reflex is not taught in schools. It is inherited. The medieval origins of waiting also explain why the line carries emotional weight beyond logic. You feel relief when order is restored. You feel anger when someone ignores it. These reactions are disproportionate to the practical impact. That is because the line is tied to deeper ideas of fairness, dignity, and belonging shaped long before modern laws. In medieval towns, waiting marked you as part of the community. To wait was to acknowledge shared rules. To refuse was to declare yourself outside them. That distinction still exists. Someone who cuts ahead is not just impatient. They are perceived as rejecting the social contract. Modern discussions about equality often overlook this inheritance. We assume lines are neutral and fair, yet medieval lines were never truly equal. Status often allowed exceptions. Clergy, nobility, and officials bypassed waiting routinely. That pattern did not vanish. It transformed. You still see it when priority lanes exist, when influence shortens wait times, when money accelerates service. The medieval logic remains intact. Order is preserved, but hierarchy survives within it. The line appears fair, while quietly accommodating privilege. Understanding this history does not make waiting easier, but it makes it clearer. You are not simply passing time. You are participating in a practice shaped by centuries of fear, discipline, faith, and negotiation. You are reenacting countless quiet moments where order held violence at bay. This story is not about politeness. It is about survival. Medieval people learned that structure kept them alive. They passed that lesson forward without words. Over time the reason faded, but the behavior endured. As you stand waiting today, your posture mirrors theirs. Your patience echoes theirs. You inherit their compromise between chaos and control. The line is boring because it works. It is invisible because it is constant. And perhaps that is the most enduring medieval legacy of all, not castles or crowns or battles, but the quiet agreement to wait your turn, trusting that order will eventually bring you forward. You hear the sound before you think about it. A bell marking an hour, a school day, a ceremony, or a warning. You may not even notice how deeply it guides your behavior. You adjust your pace. You glance at a clock. You feel late or early without knowing why. This obedience to sound has roots that reach back into medieval towns where bells ruled time more completely than any king. In the medieval world, time was not something you carried with you. There were no personal clocks. There were no watches tucked into pockets. Time belonged to the community, and it spoke aloud. Bells were its voice. They told you when to wake, when to work, when to pray, when to rest, and when to fear. You are standing in a medieval town before sunrise. The streets are quiet, then the bell rings. It is not gentle. It is loud enough to reach fields, workshops, homes, and inns. It announces morning prayer. For monks, this is a command. For townspeople, it is a signal that the day has begun. Shops open. Labor starts. Movement begins. These bells were not decorative. They were legal instruments. Town charters often specified which bells could be rung when, and for what purpose. Unauthorized ringing could result in fines or punishment. The bell did not belong to the individual. It belonged to authority. Churches controlled most bells, but their power extended far beyond religion. Bells marked market hours. Bells announced curfew. Bells signaled danger, such as fire invasion or riot. When the bell rang, you were expected to respond appropriately. Without question, you did not ask what time it was. You listened. The structure of medieval time was uneven by modern standards. Hours were not fixed lengths. Daytime hours were longer in summer, shorter in winter. Night hours reversed this pattern. Bells adapted to sunlight, not machinery. Yet everyone accepted this flexibility because the sound unified experience. Time was shared even if it was imprecise. This shared time created order. When everyone started work together, disputes were fewer. When markets opened and closed by bell sellers could not exploit confusion. When curfew rang, movement stopped. Anyone outside after that moment was suspicious. The bell simplified enforcement. Guards did not argue. The sound had already spoken. You might assume people resisted this control. In reality, many welcomed it. Bells removed uncertainty. They told you when it was acceptable to act. In a world without artificial light, predictable schedules reduced risk. Ending the day by bell lowered crime, accidents, and conflict. Monasteries refined this system with extraordinary precision. Monastic life revolved around the divine office, a sequence of prayers marked by bells throughout day and night. Monks slept in fragments, woke repeatedly, and moved in silence, guided only by sound. This discipline impressed lay visitors deeply. Bells became associated with moral order, self-control, and divine alignment. As towns grew, monasteries were no longer isolated. Their bells carried across neighborhoods. Lay people adjusted their routines to monastic time even if they did not share the prayers. Over generations, this alignment blurred the boundary between sacred and civic time. Children grew up, knowing bell patterns before words. They learned which sound meant safety, which meant work, which meant danger. This knowledge was instinctive. Bells bypassed literacy. They spoke to everyone equally. During emergencies, bells became the fastest communication system available. A specific ringing pattern could summon armed men, alert firefighters, or warn of attack. People ran toward or away from the sound automatically. This response saved lives and reinforced obedience. Yet bells also enforced power. Those who controlled them controlled rhythm. Lords, bishops, and councils fought over bell rights. Installing a bell was a declaration of authority. Destroying one was an act of rebellion. Bells were captured, melted, or silenced during conflicts precisely because they represented control over time and people. You might notice that bells rarely asked. They commanded. There was no negotiation. The sound filled space and demanded response. This shaped medieval psychology deeply. People learned that time came from outside themselves. Obedience to time was obedience to order. As commerce expanded, bells became even more important. Contracts depended on timing. Wages were calculated by bell hours. Missing a bell could mean losing work or pay. Punctuality became a survival skill long before clocks made it measurable. You still carry this inheritance. You structure your day around external signals, alarms, schedules, announcements. Even digital alerts echo the medieval bell. They interrupt, demand attention, and reorganize behavior. But medieval bells were not neutral. They favored those whose lives aligned with them. Farmers, craftsmen, monks, and merchants adapted well. Others struggled. Travelers, the sick, and the marginalized often found themselves punished for failing to obey a sound they could not always hear or reach in time. Despite this, the bell system endured. It outlasted plagues, wars, and political change. When mechanical clocks appeared, they did not replace bells, they fed them. Clocks provided precision, bells provided reach. Time became more exact, but still communal. You are living inside that compromise. You know exact minutes, yet you still respond to shared signals. School bells, work bells, public announcements, and scheduled broadcasts all descend from medieval sound authority. But as with all control systems, resistance quietly formed. People learned to bend time to personal needs. They learned to ignore certain bells. They learned to resent schedules imposed without consent. So how did a system designed for prayer and protection evolve into the strict time discipline of modern life? And why do bells still shape your sense of urgency, even when you no longer notice them? As medieval life became more complex, the bell did not lose its authority. Instead, it multiplied its meanings. You are no longer listening to a single sound that marks prayer alone. You are learning a language of sound patterns, rhythms, and intervals. Each variation carries instruction. Each instruction shapes behavior without explanation. In growing towns, bells were carefully tuned, not for beauty, but for reach. They were cast thick and heavy, so their sound would travel over rooftops, fields, and rivers. Height mattered. Towers rose not only toward heaven, but toward control. The higher the bell, the wider its influence. This was understood clearly by medieval leaders. Different bells served different purposes. The great bell marked major events. Smaller bells signaled routine moments. Some bells belonged to guilds, others to councils, others to monasteries. Conflicts arose when sounds overlapped. Whose time mattered more? Whose bell should dominate the air? These disputes were not symbolic. They affected wages, labor, and authority. If a guild bell rang earlier than the church bell, workers might begin sooner. If the church delayed its bell, markets opened late. Time was power measured in sound. You can see this tension clearly in medieval legal cases. Records describe lawsuits over unauthorized ringing. A bell rung at the wrong time could disrupt trade or prayer. Offenders were fined not for noise but for disorder. Sound out of place threatened stability. The bell also regulated morality. Bells announced fasting days, feast days, and holy days. Work stopped when the bell declared sacred time. Ignoring it was sinful and suspicious. Time was moral as much as practical. Curfew bells were among the most powerful. When they rang, fires were banked, doors closed, and streets emptied. Anyone found outside afterward was questioned. The bell turned space into zones of permission and danger. Safety depended on listening. Over time, people internalized these signals. You did not need to see the tower. You adjusted instinctively. The bell shortened arguments, ended gatherings, and dissolved crowds. It was faster than orders, and harder to challenge. When mechanical clocks entered the medieval world, they did not immediately change daily experience. Early clocks were inaccurate, expensive, and rare. Their value lay in coordinating bells more precisely. The bell remained the true authority. The clock served it. This relationship reshaped how people thought about time. Before bells, time was local, personal, and flexible. After bells, time became shared and enforceable. You were late or early not by feeling but by sound. This shift prepared society for later industrial discipline. The bell also crossed into secular punishment. Bells marked executions, public shaming, and announcements of exile. The sound gathered witnesses. Justice required an audience, and the bell provided one. Silence would have undermined authority. During plagues, bells rang constantly. They announced deaths, processions, and prayers. In some places, bells rang so often they exhausted bell ringers. Eventually, towns limited ringing to preserve sanity. This revealed something important. Bells could comfort, but they could also overwhelm. You might imagine people becoming numb to sound. In reality, they became more sensitive. They learned to distinguish urgency from routine. A sudden pattern could send a crowd running. Familiar rhythms faded into background comfort. Children learned this early. They associated sound with safety, structure, and expectation. This training followed them into adulthood. The bell taught time obedience without literacy or explanation. As trade expanded across regions, travelers encountered different bell schedules. Confusion was common. A bell that meant work in one town meant prayer in another. Yet travelers adapted quickly. Listening became survival. This adaptability allowed bell culture to spread. Colonies, missions, and new towns installed bells early. Establishing time control was a priority. Before walls, before schools, before courts, there was often a bell. You still see this today. New institutions mark their presence with sound schedules, alarms, announcements, tones. They organize people without dialogue. This is not coincidence. It is inheritance. Yet resistance continued quietly. Some ignored bells when possible. Farmers worked by light, not sound. Night workers bent to curfews. The sick and poor struggled to comply. Bells were equal in reach, but unequal in impact. As secular governments grew stronger, they adopted bell logic. Timekeeping became a civic duty. Punctuality became virtue. Lateness became fault. The bell had trained society for this shift long before laws enforced it. Eventually personal clocks appeared. Time moved into pockets and homes. Yet bells did not disappear. They became confirmations. They told you your clock was right or wrong. External authority still mattered. You might think this story ends with modern schedules replacing medieval sound. But listen closely. School bells, factory whistles, emergency sirens, public announcements all follow the same principle. A sound interrupts and demands response. The medieval bell taught you that time comes from outside and must be obeyed. Even now you feel anxiety when you miss a signal. You feel relief when you hear confirmation. This is not rational, it is learned across generations. And yet modern life has begun to challenge this inheritance. Flexible schedules, remote work, and personal alarms weaken shared sound authority. Time becomes private again. So what happens when a society trained for centuries to obey external time begins to silence its bells, and who controls time when sound no longer binds everyone together? When bells slowly lost their absolute authority, they did not vanish in protest. They faded quietly into the background of daily life. Much like the medieval habits they helped create, you still hear them, but you rarely obey them in the same direct way. Yet their influence remains, subtle and persistent, shaping how you understand urgency, lateness, and order. As personal timekeeping became common, people gained the illusion of independence from communal sound. Clocks entered homes, workshops, and eventually pockets. Time became visible and measurable at all moments. But this change did not erase centuries of conditioning. It redirected it. You no longer waited for the bell, yet you still synchronized yourself to an external standard. Church bells adapted rather than disappeared. They marked tradition rather than command. They rang for ceremonies, memorials, and celebrations. The sound shifted from instruction to reassurance. It reminded communities that time still had shared meaning, even as individuals tracked it privately. You can observe this during major events. Weddings, funerals, national commemorations, and emergencies still rely on sound to unify experience. A bell tolling for the dead asks for pause. A siren demands action. The function is medieval, even if the source has changed. Modern technology echoes this pattern. Digital alerts imitate bell logic. They interrupt. They demand attention. They reorganize behavior instantly. You may silence them, but you still feel their pull. The medieval bell taught society that time is something that acts upon you, not something you fully control. This inheritance also explains why silence can feel unsettling. In medieval towns, silence often meant danger. Bells were absent during chaos, siege, or breakdown. Sound meant order was intact. Even today, when systems fail, the lack of expected signals creates anxiety. You listen for confirmation that structure still exists. The emotional weight of punctuality is another legacy. Being late triggers shame disproportionate to the actual consequence. This reaction was trained by centuries where lateness meant disobedience or suspicion. Bells did not forgive. They rang whether you were ready or not. Yet, modern society increasingly questions this rigidity. Flexible time challenges the old assumption that everyone must move together. This shift creates freedom, but also tension. Without shared signals, coordination becomes harder. Responsibility shifts inward. You might notice how deeply you still rely on external cues. Work schedules, school times, transportation announcements, all depend on synchronized signals. When they fail, confusion spreads quickly. This reveals how incomplete the transition away from communal time truly is. The medieval bell also left a mark on authority itself. Power still announces itself through sound. Sirens, speeches, alarms, and broadcasts all command attention. They claim the right to interrupt your personal rhythm. This claim feels normal because it is ancient. Understanding this history does not require rejecting modern time. It invites awareness. You are not simply managing minutes. You are responding to a long tradition where sound organized survival. As bells recede, new questions emerge. Can societies maintain order without shared time signals? Can coordination exist without obedience? Or will new forms of bells always rise to replace the old? You may not notice the next time a bell rings, but your body will. It will pause, adjust, and listen. Just as countless medieval lives once did. You carry your name quietly. You use it without thinking. You write it, sign it, answer to it, and expect others to recognize it as uniquely yours. It feels natural. It feels personal. Yet, in the medieval world, a name was not simply a label. It was a legal tool, a social marker, and a source of obligation that followed you everywhere. In early medieval communities, names were simple. One name was often enough. Villages were small. Everyone knew everyone else. If there were two men with the same name, they were separated by context. John the miller, John from the hill, John son of William. These additions were not surnames yet. They were descriptions meant to prevent confusion. As long as life stayed local, this system worked. But medieval society did not remain small or static. Trade expanded, towns grew. Travel increased. Records multiplied. Suddenly one name was no longer enough. Identity became a problem that required regulation. You can imagine a crowded medieval town, where dozens of men answer to the same saint name, John, William, Thomas, Henry. These names were chosen for religious reasons. Parents named children after saints, hoping for protection, favor, or moral guidance. The result was uniformity. Individuality mattered less than spiritual alignment. This created practical difficulties. Taxes had to be collected, property had to be transferred, crimes had to be prosecuted. Courts needed to know who was who. Without stable naming systems, responsibility dissolved easily. A debt could vanish with a name change. A crime could be blamed on another John. Authorities responded slowly but deliberately. By the high medieval period, many regions began to require fixed identifiers. These were not yet modern surnames, but they were becoming permanent. A man known as John Baker might pass that identifier to his children. Over time, Baker stopped being a job description and became a family name. You did not choose this name. It was assigned by circumstance and then enforced by repetition. Records fixed it in place. Once written, it followed you. Changing it became difficult and suspicious. Naming laws emerged unevenly across Europe. Some regions adopted hereditary surnames earlier than others. England, after the Norman conquest, saw rapid development of fixed names due to administrative pressure. Taxation, land ownership, and legal disputes demanded clarity. Written rolls required consistency. In other regions, names remained fluid longer, but even there, authorities pushed toward stability. Parishes kept baptism records. Courts recorded defendants. Guilds listed members. Each record reinforced identity through naming. Your name became proof that you existed within the system. Without it, you were invisible. Visibility brought protection, but also obligation. You could be taxed, summoned, fined, or punished. Medieval people understood this double edge. Being named meant belonging, but it also meant being watched. Some resisted permanent naming by moving frequently or using variations. Authorities viewed this behavior with suspicion. A shifting name suggested deceit. Women experienced naming rules differently. A woman often changed names through marriage. Her identity merged into her husband's household. In records, she might appear as wife of, or widow of, rather than by her own name. Her personal identity was secondary to her legal relationship. This mattered deeply. Property rights, inheritance, and testimony depended on naming. A woman without a clear name in records struggled to assert claims. Her existence could be legally thin. Naming was also tied to morality. Criminals were publicly named. Shame attached to the name itself. Families carried the weight of a disgraced surname for generations. This discouraged misconduct and reinforced conformity. You might assume that people valued unique names. In fact, sameness was comforting. Sharing a saint's name connected you to a moral ideal and a community of believers. Individual distinction came later. Medieval identity emphasized role and relationship more than personality. Children were taught their names as duties. To honor the name was to honor family and faith. To stain it was to betray both. This pressure shaped behavior quietly and constantly. Nicknames existed, but they were risky. Some stuck, some became official. Others were insulting and temporary. A nickname that entered a record could follow you permanently. This made humor dangerous. As cities expanded, naming systems hardened. Written culture expanded faster than oral memory. What was written became real, errors persisted. Misspellings fossilized. A clerk mistake could rename a family forever. You still live with this legacy. Your name appears on documents, systems, and databases. It connects you to history, obligation, and recognition. You cannot easily escape it. This feels normal, but it is the result of centuries of administrative pressure. In medieval life, a name was not about self-expression. It was about control, clarity, and survival. It told others where you belonged and what was expected of you. Yet this system also created tension. What happened to those who did not fit neatly into records? Travelers, migrants, the poor, and the displaced often lacked stable names. They lived on the edge of legality. So as medieval naming hardened into law, identity itself became regulated. To be someone meant being named correctly. To lose your name was to lose protection. And this raises a question that medieval people slowly began to face. If your name defines you, who truly owns it? The individual who carries it, or the authority that records and enforces it? As medieval naming practices hardened into expectation, the meaning of identity shifted quietly but permanently. You are no longer known only by those who see you daily. You are now known by records you may never see, and officials you may never meet. Your name travels farther than you do, and it often arrives first. This transformation changed how people behaved. When your name could be written down, remembered, and repeated, you became cautious. Actions followed you. Reputation gained weight. In earlier centuries, a mistake might fade with memory. In a record-keeping society, it lingered. Parish registers played a central role. Baptism tied a child to a name before God and community. That name was written. It became official. Confirmation reinforced it. Marriage connected it to another household. Death closed the record. Life became a sequence of named moments. You can imagine the anxiety this created. A misspoken name at baptism could alter identity forever. Parents corrected priests carefully. Clerks held quiet power. Literacy became influence. Legal systems depended on naming consistency. A court could not judge a person who could not be identified. Witnesses were named. Defendants were named. Oaths were sworn in names. Truth became attached to words written beside a person. False naming was treated as serious wrongdoing. Impersonation was not merely deceit. It threatened the entire system of accountability. Laws punished those who used false names to avoid debts, crimes, or duties. To lie about your name was to reject order itself. Travelers faced constant challenges. Crossing regions meant encountering different naming customs. A name recognized in one town might be questioned in another. Documents became passports of identity. Without them, you relied on reputation alone. Guilds formalized naming further. Membership lists recorded names precisely. Apprentices learned under a master's name. Journeymen carried references. A name opened doors or closed them. Skill was important, but identity mattered more. For the poor, this system was double-edged. Being named allowed access to charity and protection, but it also exposed them to control. Vagrancy laws targeted those without fixed names or addresses. To be unnamed was suspicious. To be named was restrictive. Women remained constrained by naming conventions. Marriage transferred identity. Widowhood altered it again. A woman might be known by 3 different names across her life, yet never fully control any of them. Records followed households, not individuals. Some women used this fluidity strategically. They emphasized or minimized names depending on circumstance. Authorities tolerated this unevenly. Flexibility existed, but it was fragile. Naming also intersected with ethnicity and origin. Place-based names marked outsiders. John of York or Maria the Lombard carried geographic identity. This could invite opportunity or prejudice. Names revealed movement in a world uneasy about it. Over generations, surnames stabilized. Children inherited them automatically. What began as description became destiny. Occupations faded, but names remained. A family named Baker might never bake again, yet carry the identity. This permanence created pride and burden. Families guarded names carefully. Honor became collective. One member's actions affected all. This encouraged self-regulation. Communities enforced behavior to protect shared identity. You still feel this pressure. Your name represents more than you. It connects you to family history, expectations, and judgment. This feeling did not arise naturally. It was taught. Medieval authorities rarely announced these changes openly. They emerged through habit, repetition, and necessity. People adjusted slowly until the system felt inevitable. Yet, cracks remained. Marginal groups struggled to fit. The displaced, the persecuted, and the poor often lacked stable names. Their invisibility made them vulnerable. As naming laws strengthened, identity became something you carried, but did not fully own. It belonged partly to the state, the church, and the community. This tension between personal self and recorded identity did not resolve in the medieval period. It deepened. So, when a name defines your rights, your duties, and your memory, what happens when that name is questioned, altered, or taken away, and who decides which version of you is real? By the late medieval period, the connection between name and self had become so strong that losing one often meant losing the other. You existed in law, society, and memory only as long as your name could be placed correctly within records. This quiet transformation reshaped how people understood themselves long before modern ideas of identity appeared. Once surnames became hereditary, they stopped describing and started defining. A child inherited a name before any action or choice. That name carried reputation, expectation, and history. You were judged before you spoke. This was not accidental. Authorities valued predictability over individuality. Punishment relied heavily on naming. Criminals were announced publicly by name. Lists were posted. Shame followed the family. Some names became avoided. Others were forced to relocate. A bad name could poison opportunity for generations. At the same time, protection depended on name recognition. Legal claims required proof of identity. Land ownership, marriage rights, and inheritance all rested on recorded names. Those without stable identity existed in a fragile space where rights were uncertain. The church reinforced this system by tying salvation to named souls. Masses were said for the dead by name. Prayers depended on correct naming. To be forgotten was spiritually dangerous. This belief encouraged families to preserve names carefully. In some regions, names became tools of control during persecution. Authorities tracked religious minorities through naming conventions. Forced name changes erased heritage and enforced conformity. This practice would echo darkly in later centuries. You might assume that the rise of personal freedom would loosen naming control. In reality, it intensified. As states expanded, they demanded clearer records. Census lists, tax rolls, and military registers all required stable names. Yet people continued to resist in small ways. They altered spellings, used nicknames, or emphasized different parts of their identity. These acts were subtle but meaningful. They asserted humanity within a rigid system. The medieval legacy of naming still shapes modern life. Passports, identification numbers, and databases all descend from the same impulse. Names anchor systems of control. They allow order but reduce fluidity. You feel this when a mistake in a record causes confusion or denial. The system trusts the name more than the person. This logic began when written records overtook memory. Understanding this history invites reflection rather than rejection. Names allowed societies to function at scale. They reduced chaos and enabled trust among strangers. But they also limited self-definition. You carry a medieval inheritance every time you sign your name. You affirm an identity shaped by centuries of administrative necessity. It feels natural because it has been normalized across generations. As modern societies debate identity, privacy, and autonomy, they revisit questions medieval people never fully resolved. Who defines you? Who records you? Who controls the story attached to your name? The medieval world answered with authority, tradition, and record. The modern world continues to negotiate. Your name remains a quiet agreement between you and the systems around you. It grants recognition and demands accountability. And perhaps the most enduring medieval rule is this: to be known, you must be named, and once named, you are never entirely free of what that name carries forward through time. As the sun lowered behind medieval rooftops, the world did not slowly drift into rest. It stopped. Movement ended, voices quieted, doors closed, and fires dimmed. Night was not a private experience. It was regulated, enforced, and feared. You did not choose when your day ended. The town decided for you. Curfews were not suggestions. They were commands backed by law, custom, and threat. When the signal came, whether by bell horn or shouted order, you were expected to be inside. Remaining outdoors, after that moment, marked you as suspicious, reckless, or criminal. Silence and stillness became tools of survival. You can picture a medieval town at dusk. The air cools. Shadows stretch. The final bell rings. This is not a reminder. It is a boundary. From this moment, the rules change. Streets belong to guards, not citizens. Light becomes suspect. Noise becomes evidence. The word curfew comes from the command to cover fire. Open flames were dangerous in wooden towns packed tightly together. At night, when visibility was low, a single unattended hearth could destroy entire neighborhoods. Authorities learned that fire control required social control. People were ordered indoors so fires could be monitored and extinguished. But fire was only the beginning. Darkness concealed crime. Without street lighting, night favored theft, assault, and escape. Curfews simplified enforcement. Anyone outside could be questioned, detained, or punished without complex investigation. The rule was simple: be inside or be guilty. You might think people resented this deeply. Some did, yet many accepted it as protection. Night was genuinely dangerous. Medical help was scarce. Travel was risky. Curfews reduced harm by limiting opportunity. Fear reinforced obedience. Church teaching supported this structure. Night was associated with temptation, sin, and disorder. Darkness symbolized moral danger. Staying indoors was framed as virtuous. Silence became a sign of discipline. Loud behavior after curfew drew moral judgment, as well as legal risk. Children learned early that night was not theirs. Parents warned them. Stories reinforced fear. The idea of wandering after dark became associated with punishment, spirits, and shame. This training lasted a lifetime. Curfews varied by place and season. Winter nights came early. Summer allowed longer activity, yet the principle remained constant. Authority controlled darkness. You moved when allowed and stopped when told. Markets closed strictly. Taverns shut or faced fines. Singing, shouting, or gatherings could trigger intervention. Guards patrolled with lanterns and weapons. Their presence was meant to be seen. Silence was compliance. Night work existed, but it was regulated. Bakers, millers, and some craftsmen received permission to operate after dark. This permission marked them as legitimate. Without it, work became suspect. Paper or tokens sometimes proved exemption. Identity and time merged. Women faced stricter enforcement. A woman outdoors at night risked accusations that damaged reputation permanently. Even lawful reasons could be questioned. Curfews reinforced gender control quietly and effectively. Foreigners suffered more. Unfamiliar faces after dark raised alarm. Curfews protected insiders and excluded outsiders. This strengthened local identity but deepened suspicion of strangers. During unrest, curfews tightened. After riots, rebellions, or plague nights became more controlled, not less. Authorities feared gatherings and rumors spreading under cover of darkness. Silence prevented coordination. You can see how this shaped daily rhythm. Life compressed into daylight. Tasks rushed to completion. Evening carried urgency. Night belonged to authority and danger, not rest or freedom. Over time, this discipline became internalized. People felt unease outside after dark, even when enforcement weakened. Darkness itself triggered caution. This emotional response outlasted the laws. Curfews also created shared stillness. Entire towns slept together. Silence became communal. This reduced conflict but also erased individuality. Everyone paused at once. As medieval towns grew and lighting improved, some restrictions eased. Yet curfews did not disappear. They adapted, hours shifted, exceptions multiplied. The core idea survived. You still live with this inheritance. Night laws exist during emergencies. Quiet hours are enforced. Being outside late still attracts attention. Darkness remains regulated space. The medieval fear of night never fully left. It softened but endured. Silence still signals safety. Noise still invites scrutiny. But this system was never perfect. People resisted secretly. Lovers met smugglers, moved, and crimes occurred despite control. Darkness always offered opportunity alongside fear. So as medieval curfews shaped obedience and silence, they also revealed a tension between safety and freedom that has never resolved. When does protection become control, and who decides when the night truly belongs to you? As medieval towns matured, curfews evolved from simple fire control measures into sophisticated systems of social regulation. You are no longer just responding to a bell or horn. You are navigating a network of rules, enforcement, and expectation that shapes your very perception of night. Every lantern, every patrolling guard, every shuttered door signals that darkness is not private, but collectively managed. Compliance has become instinctive, even before law intervenes. The mechanics of enforcement were elaborate. Guards were assigned sectors of streets and alleys, often rotating to prevent corruption or fatigue. They carried lanterns to illuminate suspicious corners, staffs to assert authority, and sometimes weapons to back warnings. Their patrols were predictable, but unpredictability remained in how they interpreted behavior. A group of young men talking too loudly could be dispersed. A lone traveler could be stopped and questioned. Observation alone became a means of control, shaping conduct without written orders. Curfews were not uniform across social strata. Nobles and clergy often enjoyed exemptions. Their households maintained private lighting, secured gardens and servants to enforce boundaries, allowing them to traverse space without scrutiny. In contrast, peasants, laborers, and women of modest means faced stricter compliance. The night highlighted hierarchy. Obedience was demanded in proportion to status. Vulnerability was encoded in the system itself. You can imagine how this system affected social psychology. People internalized rules, even when no guard was near. Silence and stillness became habitual. Fear, habit, and communal expectation worked together. Families instructed children carefully. The night belonged to authority, and disobedience could bring physical punishment, loss of reputation, or social censure. Tales of spirits, demons, and wandering spirits reinforced obedience, blending superstition with civic law. Economic life adapted to curfew. Markets closed early, craftsmen adjusted schedules, and travel was timed to ensure arrival within safe hours. Some trades, millers, bakers, night watchmen, received explicit permission to operate after dark. These permissions were documented, and sometimes displayed publicly. This stratification of activity reinforced social hierarchy while maintaining essential functions under controlled conditions. Curfews also served as instruments of public order, beyond everyday risk. During times of plague, civil unrest, or foreign threat, curfew hours could be tightened dramatically. Towns that had once allowed moderate evening activity suddenly restricted movement entirely. Bells or horns rang, doors were locked, and guards intensified patrols. Compliance became a matter of survival. Resistance was rare but remembered. Chroniclers recorded the defiance of youths, lovers, and the desperate moments when human desire clashed with communal order. Religious authorities layered moral expectation on top of legal restriction. Night symbolized temptation, sin, and moral danger. Staying indoors was not only safe, it was virtuous. Noise after curfew, even if harmless, suggested recklessness or moral weakness. Silence and stillness became markers of piety. This moral framing reinforced legal obedience. Civic law and spiritual teaching intertwined, and compliance carried dual rewards: safety and moral approval. Over time, curfews shaped the very perception of night itself. People did not simply follow orders. They feared the night. Darkness became a shared, socially constructed space where danger, authority, and morality overlapped. It was not just about being caught outdoors. It was about inhabiting a world where the absence of light indicated vulnerability, where sound and movement were tightly surveilled, and where compliance equated to both survival and acceptance. This internalization explains why curfew persisted, even when enforcement became less strict. Communities maintained quiet hours, neighborhoods self-regulated, and individuals adapted behavior in anticipation of oversight. Modern echoes remain in quiet residential zones, noise ordinances, and expectations of private time after dark. The medieval mind, trained for centuries to respect night as controlled space, persists subtly in these behaviors. Yet tension persisted. People resisted in small ways: clandestine gatherings, secret meetings, and nighttime travel for necessity or pleasure. These acts, while risky, reveal the limits of imposed control. Even in a society that meticulously regulated movement, human needs and desires shaped the interpretation and enforcement of rules. Authority relied not only on law and patrols, but also on social pressure and the internalization of fear. Curfews also created paradoxical effects on community cohesion. By restricting nighttime movement, they compressed daily activity into daylight hours, concentrating labor, social interaction, and commerce. Streets emptied after dark, creating communal silence that was both protective and oppressive. Everyone participated in the pause, yet within that pause, personal freedom was sharply curtailed. And so the medieval night became a study in order, hierarchy, and psychological adaptation. People lived with constant awareness that darkness was not their own, yet the system they internalized created safety, predictability, and paradoxically, a shared social rhythm. Silence became as important as light, obedience as crucial as action. But a question lingered across generations. What happens when enforced silence confronts the human need for movement, interaction, or survival? Can control ever fully contain human activity, or will night always offer an opportunity to test limits, challenge authority, and redefine freedom? By the late medieval period, curfews had evolved into an intricate system of social, moral, and legal regulation that shaped daily life far beyond mere fire prevention. You are now living in a world where the night itself carries authority. The streets are silent, doors are locked, and shadows are monitored, not just by guards but by communal expectation. You do not step outside lightly. Instinct and habit have been trained over generations. Curfews had become instruments of both protection and control. They safeguarded towns from accidental fires, theft and violence, while simultaneously reinforcing hierarchy and obedience. The nobility, clergy, and those with special permissions could traverse the night with relative freedom, while ordinary townspeople faced scrutiny and consequences. Even when enforcement was lax, fear and moral conditioning ensured compliance. Silence was no longer just a law, it became a social contract internalized by citizens. The psychological effect of curfews extended into the rhythms of daily life. Daylight became precious, and activity compressed into limited hours. Markets, workshops, and households adapted their routines to ensure productivity and safety before darkness fell. The night was not a time for leisure, it was a boundary. Children learned to respect it, women experienced heightened surveillance, and travelers faced heightened suspicion. Silence became a communal experience, shaping behavior collectively even without explicit enforcement. Yet curfews were never absolute. People found ways to navigate or resist restrictions. Lovers met in secret, merchants worked under permission, and those in urgent need traversed streets despite the danger. These acts of quiet defiance reveal the limitations of imposed control. Human need, desire, and necessity could never be fully constrained, even under centuries of strict regulation. Authority relied not only on enforcement, but also on internalized fear, moral pressure, and social expectation. Over time, curfews faded as towns modernized. Streets became better lit, and new social structures emerged. However, their legacy persists in modern life. Quiet hours in residential areas, restricted access at night, and the expectation of rest reflect the medieval understanding that darkness is a shared space requiring discipline. The medieval mind, trained over generations, still influences how societies perceive night, risk, and obedience. Curfews also left subtle marks on the cultural imagination. Darkness became associated with danger and moral risk. Literature, folklore, and even daily cautionary tales reinforced the idea that night is a space of potential threat. People internalized these lessons, navigating the dark with caution even when no law directly enforced it. Finally, the medieval curfew exemplifies the delicate balance between safety and freedom. It shows how communities can regulate behavior for collective benefit while restricting personal autonomy. It also illustrates human adaptability. Rules are followed, but necessity and desire always test boundaries. Even as laws weaken, habits persist. Obedience is not only taught, it is lived. As you reflect on the curfew, consider this. The night is both protective and oppressive, communal and constraining. The medieval town trained its citizens to negotiate these tensions silently, shaping instincts and expectations that survive in subtle ways today. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: the structures of authority that governed the darkness continue to echo, influencing how you respond to rules, risk, and the quiet of night even now. You probably think of a handshake as a simple gesture, polite, brief, and almost automatic. Yet this small movement carries centuries of social, legal, and survival meaning. In the medieval world, a handshake was never trivial. It was a public contract, a demonstration of trust, and sometimes a literal safeguard against violence. Every grip told a story, and every refusal could have serious consequences. Imagine yourself in a bustling medieval marketplace. You are about to negotiate with a merchant, another traveler, or perhaps a minor noble. Words alone are not enough. Deception is possible, Violence is possible. Legal enforcement is slow, inconsistent, and limited. In such a world, gestures become proof. You extend your hand to show it is empty. The other person does the same. The handshake is not just greeting, it is evidence. It declares, I come in peace. I honor my word, I consent to this transaction. This practice has roots in far older traditions. Anthropologists trace it back to antiquity, where extending the right hand was a way to display weaponlessness. In the medieval European context, the gesture became formalized and symbolic. Knights clasped hands as a sign of oath-taking, guild members exchanged grips to verify membership, and townspeople greeted one another in ways that demonstrated civility and security. The act of touching hands affirmed that both parties were present, accountable, and socially aligned. Guilds played a particularly significant role in standardizing handshakes. Membership in a guild conferred economic opportunity and protection, but also obligations. A handshake during admission signified acceptance of rules, acknowledgement of hierarchy, and willingness to uphold ethical standards. It was witnessed by others, reinforcing social visibility. Breaking the contract after that handshake was not merely dishonorable, it was dangerous. One's reputation, and sometimes livelihood, depended on it. Outside the guild, handshakes functioned similarly in markets, courts, and political encounters. When a deal was struck, the handshake sealed it. Written contracts were scarce, literacy was limited, and enforcement could be inconsistent. The handshake served as public evidence, observable by others, and thus enforceable through communal memory and social pressure. To refuse it could imply hostility, deceit, or social ignorance. You might lose access to trade, protection, or favor if your gesture was lacking. Beyond commerce, handshakes had ritual and ceremonial significance. Oaths sworn in courts or councils were often accompanied by grips, sometimes with symbolic objects or the touch of the left hand as a sign of solemnity. Handshakes in these contexts were more than gestures. They were performative assertions of trust, legality, and moral responsibility. The touch demonstrated that promises were binding, and that parties were accountable before God, the community, and law. The medieval emphasis on visibility reinforced the handshake's role. Observers acted as witnesses. Public trust was inseparable from public performance. You could not privately assure someone and claim social legitimacy. Others had to see. This necessity of visibility shaped interactions across towns, markets, and courts, embedding a culture in which small gestures carried outsized meaning. Yet the handshake was not without its risks. Accepting a handshake from the wrong person could lead to deceit or harm. Extending your hand too casually might appear disrespectful. Social norms governed grip, duration, and eye contact. Mistakes could result in embarrassment, insult, or even physical conflict. The medieval handshake demanded awareness and precision. It was a practice rooted in survival, as much as courtesy. You might imagine that the ritual faded as literacy increased, and contracts became formalized. Yet even as written agreements grew common, the handshake persisted. It had become a socially reinforced symbol of integrity, a ritual learned from observation, habit, and necessity. Its survival into modern life is testimony to the deep embedding of trust mechanisms forged in practical, often dangerous circumstances. Children were trained early to understand these signals. Apprentices learned to greet masters, merchants, and fellow laborers with appropriate gestures. Mistakes were corrected. Socialization extended beyond words. Through repetition, observation, and consequence, the handshake became both habit and social expectation. Interestingly, regional variation existed. Certain towns or guilds emphasized stronger grips, prolonged contact, or combined handshakes with bows. Others preferred simpler, lighter grips. These differences signaled belonging and identity. Mastery of local customs marked you as informed and trustworthy. Failure marked you as an outsider, vulnerable to suspicion. And so the medieval handshake was simultaneously practical, social, and symbolic. It mediated trust, verified presence, reinforced hierarchy, and allowed commerce to occur in a world where law and enforcement were uneven. The gesture was as much about survival and order as it was about civility. But the evolution of this simple gesture raises a question. How did an act born of precaution, verification, and public accountability transform into a symbol of politeness, professionalism, and casual greeting? And more subtly, what does the persistence of this ancient social contract tell us about how medieval practices continue to shape our understanding of trust, obligation, and interpersonal expectation even today. As medieval society matured, the handshake evolved from a practical gesture into a deeply embedded social contract. You are no longer only showing your hand to indicate weaponlessness. You are signaling identity, reputation, and adherence to communal norms. Every grip, every clasp, conveys subtle information about trustworthiness, social standing, and intention. The handshake had become a language before language, a behavioral code encoded in touch. Guilds and courts were at the forefront of this development. Within guilds, apprentices were taught not just the mechanics of the handshake, but its context. A firm, visible grip demonstrated commitment to rules, respect for hierarchy, and recognition of shared responsibility. Missteps could be dangerous. A weak handshake might signal incompetence or indifference. An overly aggressive grip could be interpreted as challenge or threat. Observers, the masters, peers, and other community members evaluated these gestures continuously. Public accountability reinforced compliance. The handshake also became crucial in commerce. Contracts were rare, literacy uneven, and legal systems slow. A handshake effectively sealed agreements in a public, verifiable way. Both parties were bound by communal memory, reputation, and social pressure. If someone betrayed a deal, witnesses could attest that a handshake had occurred. Reputation could be damaged, privileges revoked, or business opportunities lost. In this sense, the handshake functioned as a pre-legal enforcement mechanism, a low-cost, socially enforced contract that maintained order when formal systems could not. Ceremonial and ritual contexts amplified the handshake's significance. In courts, councils, and assemblies, handshakes accompanied oaths, pledges, and other formal declarations. Sometimes combined with symbols, like touching a cross or passing a token, the gesture became performative proof of integrity. It was not enough to speak a promise. A handshake validated that promise through physical confirmation, public observation, and shared moral code. The act bridged law, religion, and community expectation in a single visible motion. This public nature of the handshake was crucial. Witnesses ensured compliance and discouraged deception. Medieval society depended on shared accountability, not just formal authority. By participating in the handshake, both parties signaled that they recognized communal norms, and that violation would carry social consequences. The gesture was thus a microcosm of medieval governance, decentralized, socially enforced, and reliant on observation and participation rather than coercion alone. Yet the handshake carried inherent risk. Trust had to be given cautiously. Accepting a handshake from the wrong individual could expose you to deceit, theft, or violence. People evaluated each gesture carefully. Grip, eye contact, posture, and timing all conveyed meaning. Misreading a handshake could have social or economic consequences. Practicing the gesture was as much about survival as about etiquette. Handshakes also reflected social hierarchy and identity. Nobility, merchants, clergy, and commoners each had different expectations. The gesture could reinforce dominance, signal equality, or recognize membership. Regional and institutional variations added layers of meaning. A handshake that worked in one town or guild might be interpreted differently in another. Correctly performing the gesture signaled insider status, while failure marked you as an outsider or novice. Despite the eventual rise of literacy and written contracts, the handshake persisted. Its role shifted gradually from a functional proof of trust to a symbolic assertion of good faith and professionalism. The gesture remained socially enforced. Failing to perform it properly could still damage reputation or relationships. In this sense, medieval habits endured, shaping modern interactions even when the original practical necessity no longer existed. Children and apprentices internalized these practices early. Observation, repetition, and correction trained behavior. The handshake became automatic, yet its significance was understood. It communicated accountability, reliability, and moral alignment. Training emphasized subtlety, eye contact, firmness, and timing mattered as much as the act itself. Ultimately, the medieval handshake illustrates how social rituals evolve. What began as a method for survival, demonstrating unarmed status and trust, transformed into a formalized practice, then a symbolic gesture, and finally, a near-universal social custom. Its persistence reveals the power of embodied practices, physical gestures that encode meaning and expectation, transmitted across generations, quietly shaping social life long after their original purpose has faded. And yet, the enduring question remains: how much of your sense of trust, etiquette, and obligation is inherited from centuries of medieval behavioral coding. How much of modern civility still functions as a subtle enforcement mechanism, linking you to the same concerns for survival, observation, and reputation that once governed life in a marketplace centuries ago? By the late medieval period, the handshake had fully transitioned from a practical tool of survival to a deeply ingrained social ritual. What began as a gesture to demonstrate weaponlessness had evolved into a complex language of trust, accountability, and communal recognition. You no longer merely signal peaceful intent, you assert identity, reputation, and moral alignment with a single movement. The handshake's role in commerce remained foundational. Merchants, craftsmen, and traders continued to use it as a public affirmation of agreements. Written contracts grew more common, but the act of physically touching hands retained authority. Witnesses were present not just to verify a deal, but to ensure that social norms were respected. A broken handshake or one performed incorrectly could jeopardize business opportunities, reputation, and social standing. In this way, the medieval handshake functioned as both law and moral contract, a human-scale enforcement system before bureaucratic mechanisms could reliably do the work. Ritual and ceremonial contexts amplified its significance. Councils, courts, and guild meetings often required handshakes to accompany oaths, pledges, and confirmations. Touch was performative, visible, and binding. It conveyed something that words alone could not: physical proof of consent, integrity, and accountability. Public participation transformed the handshake into an institution, embedding moral and social authority into a simple gesture. Observers became co-enforcers, and the social weight of the handshake extended far beyond the participants themselves. The persistence of the handshake into modern life reflects the enduring power of such practices. Even though threats of violence and the necessity of immediate verification are largely gone, the gesture still communicates trust, professionalism, and mutual respect. Firm grips, eye contact, and timing convey subtle signals about character and intent, echoing centuries of social learning. When you shake hands today, you are unconsciously participating in a lineage that trained medieval townspeople to navigate a world where survival depended on trust, observation, and public accountability. Cultural variations persisted, shaping regional norms. A handshake in one guild might require a stronger grip, another might include ritualized bows. Mastery of these subtleties indicated belonging, experience, and social awareness. Failure to perform the gesture correctly marked outsiders, novices, or those unaware of communal expectations. In this sense, the handshake was not merely personal, it was social and regulatory, a behavioral code embedded in everyday interaction. The medieval handshake also illustrates how physical gestures can encode moral and social rules. Unlike law or written contracts, the handshake relied on human perception, memory, and judgment. It enforced honesty and compliance without coercion, functioning as a low-cost but high-stakes social technology. Even as societies evolved and formal legal systems emerged, the gesture endured, shaping how communities, professions, and individuals defined trust and accountability. You might think of the handshake today as courteous or formal, yet its roots are far more practical and far more human. It reflects centuries of negotiation between necessity and civility, survival and social order. By engaging in this gesture, you participate in an ancient system of verification that quietly enforces behavior, reinforces reputation, and structures human interaction. And so, the medieval handshake leaves you with a lingering thought. A simple touch of hands carries the weight of history, encoding lessons about trust, observation, and accountability that have survived centuries. The next time you extend your hand, you are performing a ritual born of danger, law, and necessity, a subtle inheritance from a world where survival depended on public acknowledgement and mutual respect. When you think of medieval travel, you might imagine rough paths, carts stuck in mud, and slow journeys across sprawling forests. Roads were more than mere routes. They were lifelines connecting towns, markets, and kingdoms. Yet they were also instruments of power, control, and social regulation. You did not travel freely. Every path carried rules, expectations, and risks, shaping the way society moved, interacted, and developed. In early medieval Europe, roads were often inherited from Roman infrastructure. Some were well-engineered stone routes, still serviceable centuries after the empire fell. Others were simple dirt tracks carved by centuries of foot traffic, livestock, and carts. The quality of a road determined more than speed. It dictated economic opportunity, access to justice, and even survival. A merchant, with access to a paved route, could transport goods efficiently, while someone relying on poorly maintained paths faced delays, spoilage, and vulnerability to attack. Travel was not just physical, it was deeply social and political. Roads were governed by local lords, abbeys, and emerging municipal authorities. Each stretch of land carried expectations. Tolls, customs, and checkpoints were common. Travelers often had to prove identity, pay fees, or gain permission to cross certain territories. Roads were not neutral. They reflected the authority and reach of whoever controlled them. You could be delayed or detained simply because you were on the wrong path at the wrong time. Maintenance of roads was itself a complex social undertaking. Villages were often required to contribute labor or resources to keep paths passable. Kings and regional authorities issued mandates for repair, sometimes threatening fines for neglect. The roads were communal projects, but enforcement was uneven. Floods, erosion, and wear from carts could render a major route impassable for months. Travelers learned to plan carefully, avoid weak points, and anticipate seasonal changes. The design and location of roads influenced patterns of trade. Markets emerged at crossroads, inns and hostels at strategic points, and settlements grew where routes converged. Roads were arteries of commerce. They brought food, tools, raw materials, and luxury goods from distant regions. Yet they also transmitted disease, rumors, and cultural practices, linking communities in ways that were both practical and transformative. A road was not just a physical connector, it was a social and economic conduit. Security was a constant concern. Roads were dangerous, particularly in remote areas. Bandits, rogue knights, and rival factions made travel risky. Travelers often journeyed in groups, hired escorts, or carried weapons for self-protection. Towns and lords sometimes posted watch stations or patrolled key stretches, but coverage was never complete. Knowledge of safe paths, trustworthy inns, and reliable guides became critical survival skills. Local experience mattered more than maps or written directions. Interestingly, roads also reinforced social hierarchies. Nobles and officials enjoyed priority access or maintained private routes. Merchants with wealth could secure protection or pay fees to ensure safe passage. Ordinary peasants often walked on marginal tracks, exposed to danger and delay. Roads codified privilege as much as connectivity, shaping how communities moved and interacted. The season and weather dramatically altered road use. Winter snow, spring mud, and heavy rains could make even short trips treacherous. River crossings required ferries or fording, sometimes dangerous or impossible. These environmental realities meant that travel was not just a matter of will but of timing, preparation, and local knowledge. A day's journey could become a week's ordeal under unfavorable conditions. Despite these obstacles, roads shaped cultural exchange. Ideas, news, and innovations traveled alongside goods. Merchants brought stories from distant markets. Pilgrims shared religious practices. Officials carried legal edicts from one town to another. Roads were the veins through which medieval society circulated information as well as material resources. The movement of people and ideas relied on paths that were often taken for granted, but carefully maintained and regulated. Travel also created shared expectations of behavior. Inns, bridges, and crossroads were governed by local custom. Hospitality, payment, and respect for property were monitored. Violations could result in fines, social censure, or violence. Every traveler had to learn not only the route, but also the social code that defined acceptable conduct along it. Yet roads were not permanent in practice. Even Roman-era routes could fall into disrepair, forcing detours and adaptations. Some towns prospered by being on a main road, others declined when paths shifted. The geography of travel shaped economic and political landscapes. Access to routes could define success, survival, and influence. This combination of physical, social, and political factors made medieval roads central to life, yet complex and demanding. You could not assume freedom or safety. You navigated authority, custom, and natural obstacles simultaneously. Roads were as much about governance and social structure as they were about movement. And yet, despite all preparation, the unpredictability of travel remained. Weather, bandits, misdirection, and accidents could derail even the most careful journey. Every trip carried risk. Roads connected life and opportunity, but they also exposed vulnerability. So consider this: when you walk or drive freely today, you inherit centuries of layered control, maintenance, and social expectation. Medieval roads were not neutral. They were tools of power, culture, and survival. How much of your modern sense of mobility depends on these historical systems, and how much of freedom is built upon centuries of carefully regulated paths? As medieval roads matured into complex networks, their significance expanded far beyond mere paths connecting villages. They became instruments of economic power, social control, and cultural exchange. You could not travel without encountering the layers of authority, expectation, and risk embedded in every stretch of roadway. Roads shaped behavior as much as geography, determining who moved, when, and under what conditions. Economic life depended heavily on these routes. Markets, fairs, and trade centers thrived at crossroads, where accessibility drew merchants and consumers alike. Roads dictated opportunity. A town on a major route could prosper through tolls, trade, and access to news, while a community bypassed by shifting paths could fade into obscurity. Merchants relied on predictability, not just for distance but for the reliability of the infrastructure itself. Broken bridges, flooded fords, or neglected road sections could halt commerce, ruin shipments, and disrupt livelihoods. The control of roads reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Lords and landowners asserted authority over stretches passing through their domains. They collected tolls, demanded labor for maintenance, and sometimes restricted passage to those deemed undesirable. Nobles enjoyed priority access, while peasants often faced longer, riskier routes. Travelers learned to navigate both the physical terrain and the political terrain, knowing which routes offered safety, which were patrolled, and where one might encounter suspicion or harassment. Security remained a constant concern. Banditry, rogue soldiers, and opportunistic criminals made even familiar roads hazardous. Merchants often traveled in convoys or hired armed escorts. Inns and way stations were not merely places to rest. They were nodes of surveillance and social negotiation. Hosts could inform authorities, provide warnings, or exploit travelers for profit. Every interaction along the road carried layers of risk and obligation, and social intelligence often mattered more than physical preparation. Roads also facilitated the flow of ideas, customs, and culture. Pilgrims, diplomats, scholars, and merchants carried information as reliably as they carried goods. Religious practices spread along pilgrimage routes, legal innovations traveled with officials, and tales of distant events arrived in local towns through passing travelers. Roads were the arteries of both commerce and communication, allowing medieval society to function on regional and even international scales despite limited formal governance. Maintenance of roads was a communal and regulated responsibility. Local populations often provided labor for repairs under feudal obligations. Kings, bishops, or city councils issued decrees mandating upkeep. Bridges, fords, and causeways required constant attention. Roads were living infrastructure. They changed with seasons, weather, and usage patterns. Travelers had to adapt continuously, learning when to delay journeys, when to seek alternatives, and how to interpret signs of danger or repair. The psychological dimension of travel was equally significant. A journey was never neutral. It required constant vigilance, planning, and negotiation. The roads reinforced social norms, respect for property, hospitality, and local authority. Misbehavior could lead to fines, detention, or physical confrontation. Every step of the journey was measured against communal expectations, and survival depended on social, as well as physical navigation. Interestingly, roads shaped urban and rural development simultaneously. Towns positioned themselves at junctions to maximize access, creating hubs of trade and administration. Villages with poor road connections faced isolation, limited commerce, and social stagnation. Roads literally shaped human settlement patterns, concentrating population and opportunity along corridors of connectivity. Despite the apparent order, roads remained unpredictable. Natural forces, seasonal conditions, and human interference could render paths impassable. Travelers developed intimate knowledge of geography, climate, and local customs, relying on experience as much as maps or written instructions. Even when formal structures existed, patrols, tolls, guild oversight, risk was never entirely eliminated. Every journey required judgment and adaptability. The medieval road, then, was not just a physical structure, but a social instrument. It channeled commerce, regulated interaction, enforced hierarchy, and transmitted culture. It demanded compliance and savvy, shaped opportunity and vulnerability, and integrated law, custom, and environment into everyday movement. It was simultaneously empowering and constraining, connecting towns and people while structuring power and expectation. And so, the road becomes more than a route. it is a lens into medieval life. By studying the way paths were built, maintained and traversed, you glimpse the social, economic and political logic of the era. Roads were as much about control, obligation, and hierarchy as they were about movement. You move along them physically, but your behavior is always subtly guided by centuries of learned expectation. Yet this raises a question. If roads dictated opportunity, security, and social order, how did individuals navigate moments of exception, danger, crisis, or necessity when the established rules of movement no longer applied? How much freedom truly existed along medieval paths, and how much of daily life was structured by invisible lines drawn along stone, dirt, and memory? By the late medieval period, roads had become central to the organization of society, shaping not only commerce and travel, but the very rhythm of life. You could not think of a journey as a simple passage from point A to point B. Each road carried layers of authority, expectation, and risk. Control over routes meant control over people, trade, and information. Roads were the arteries of civilization, but they were also instruments of hierarchy and regulation. Economic power was embedded in these networks. Merchants depended on reliable roads for timely transport of goods. A well-maintained route could ensure profit, while delays from impassable sections could ruin entire consignments. Fairs and marketplaces clustered at crossroads, drawing both buyers and sellers, creating hubs of trade and opportunity. Roads determined which towns flourished and which stagnated. Success depended on access as much as skill, capital, or resources. Social hierarchy was reinforced along the road. Nobles, officials, and clergy could move with relative freedom, while peasants and common travelers faced tolls, patrols, and restrictions. Special permissions, passes, or letters of safe conduct functioned as privileges, distinguishing insiders from outsiders. Roads codified power into physical space. Movement was both a necessity and a measure of social standing. Security remained a constant concern. Banditry, rogue soldiers, and opportunistic thieves made every journey potentially dangerous. Travelers learned to rely on groups, hire escorts, and consult local guides. Inns, bridges, and way stations were more than rest stops. They were points of intelligence, negotiation, and sometimes enforcement. Travelers' behavior was continuously observed and judged. The road functioned as both pathway and social checkpoint. Cultural transmission relied on these routes as well. Pilgrims carried religious ideas, merchants transmitted stories, and officials brought laws and edicts from distant authorities. Roads enabled exchange far beyond material goods. Knowledge, customs, and innovations traveled along these channels. A single road could link communities separated by hundreds of miles, knitting together regional and national networks of information. Yet, roads were unpredictable. Weather, terrain, and human interference could render travel treacherous. Rivers flooded, carts broke, and repairs lagged. Travelers adapted through local knowledge, timing, and improvisation. Survival often depended as much on experience and foresight as on physical endurance. Roads were tools of society, but they required constant negotiation. Psychologically, roads shaped perception of space, time, and authority. A journey demanded vigilance, respect for local rules, and awareness of hierarchy. Every crossing, bridge, or toll gate was an encounter with law, custom, and social expectation. You could not move freely. Movement was always measured, observed, and constrained by multiple layers of control. Yet this constraint also created structure, predictability, and shared understanding, essential for social cohesion. Medieval roads, therefore, were far more than infrastructure. They were instruments of power, commerce, socialization, and culture. They reinforced hierarchies, enabled trade, transmitted ideas, and trained travelers in the subtle rhythms of obedience and negotiation. To traverse a medieval road was to participate in a system that organized life itself. Even today, modern road networks echo these patterns. Trade hubs, tolls, and traffic regulations reflect the same principles: access, control, and social order. What feels like freedom of movement is layered atop centuries of learned patterns, expectations, and infrastructure designed to manage risk, enforce authority, and shape interaction. The medieval road was the blueprint. And so, as you imagine traveling along these ancient paths, consider this: each step, each crossing, each toll or checkpoint was a negotiation with authority, nature, and community. Roads connected life but also constrained it, offering both opportunity and risk. The question lingers: how much of the freedom you experience today is inherited from centuries of routes designed not just to carry people, but to organize society itself, teaching them where to go, how to act, and what to trust along the way. You might assume that medieval life revolved around hunting, farming, or cooking simply to survive. But food in the Middle Ages was far more regulated than you might think. Every meal was embedded within a network of social expectations, local laws, religious customs, and economic restrictions. You did not simply eat what you wanted. What, when, and how you ate was closely monitored, often by officials whose authority reached deep into daily life. Town authorities, guilds, and even the church established detailed rules governing food. Bakers were expected to maintain consistent weight and quality in bread. Butchers had to inspect meat, certify freshness, and ensure proper hygiene, at least by the standards of the time. Markets had inspectors who measured grain, checked scales, and ensured fairness in transactions. Failure to comply could result in fines, public humiliation, or confiscation. Every loaf, every piece of meat, every barrel of ale carried the imprint of law and oversight. Bread, in particular, held immense importance. It was the staple of most diets, and therefore, a focus of regulation. Bakers' guilds enforced standards rigorously. Regulations specified the proportion of flour, the acceptable size of loaves, and even the timing of baking. Towns sometimes appointed a bread weigher to monitor compliance. When regulations failed or loaf sizes shrank unexpectedly, riots occasionally erupted. Bread shortages were not just economic events, they were social crises, capable of destabilizing entire communities. Meat and fish were similarly regulated, often influenced by religious observance. Laws dictated when certain foods could be sold or consumed. Lent, for instance, required abstention from meat on specific days, while fish markets adapted accordingly. Authorities monitored these practices, ensuring compliance both for moral reasons and to maintain social cohesion. Breaking food laws could invite fines or moral censure, emphasizing that eating was never purely private. It was a matter of communal order and spiritual discipline. Weights and measures were central to food regulation. Scales were standardized where possible, and market inspectors enforced their use. Merchants who shortchanged customers undermined trust in trade, potentially causing unrest. Accuracy was demanded, and deceit punished. Food became a legal instrument as much as a necessity, binding citizens to rules that enforced fairness, accountability, and predictability. Storage and preservation also fell under regulation. Salted meat, pickled vegetables, and barrels of ale had to meet certain standards to prevent spoilage or disease. Officials inspected storage facilities, ensuring compliance with hygiene and safety practices. While standards may seem rudimentary today, they reflected a growing awareness of risk and the communal responsibility to minimize harm. Foodborne illness could threaten entire towns. Regulation was a preventative measure, both pragmatic and moral. Guilds and trade networks reinforced these rules. Membership conferred both privilege and obligation. You could sell in town markets, but only if you followed the regulations. Guild oversight included apprenticeship training, inspections, and certification. Non-compliance risked expulsion, fines, or worse. In this way, food laws intertwined with economic hierarchy, social status, and professional identity. Religious influence extended even further. Monastic communities followed strict dietary rules, influencing surrounding markets and towns. Fasting days, feast days, and meat prohibitions shaped both production and consumption. Pilgrims and travelers brought demand for certain foods, prompting market adjustments. Religious and civic regulations together created a layered system of expectations that governed behavior in subtle and explicit ways. The consequences of violating these laws were often public and instructive. Offenders might be paraded through town with symbols of shame, have goods confiscated, or be fined. Punishment served not only to deter, but to communicate communal standards. Observing these consequences taught citizens the boundaries of acceptable behavior, turning daily life into a continuous lesson in compliance and social order. Food regulation also reflected broader social and political concerns. Grain shortages, price inflation, or spoilage could spark unrest. Authorities used regulation to stabilize markets and prevent rebellion, ensuring that townspeople could afford and access basic sustenance was as much a matter of governance as morality. Control over food meant control over society, subtly reinforcing hierarchies and the reach of local power. Yet, despite these systems, loopholes, improvisation, and human ingenuity persisted. People found ways to circumvent restrictions, adapt to scarcity, and manage supply creatively. Smuggling, barter, and informal trade networks flourished alongside formal oversight. The balance between enforcement and survival created a dynamic interplay that shaped medieval daily life, highlighting the tension between authority and necessity. By examining these regulations, you can see that food in the Middle Ages was more than nourishment. It was a nexus of law, religion, commerce, and social expectation. Every meal was an interaction with authority and tradition. Eating was not only about survival, but about negotiating a web of rules designed to maintain order, fairness, and communal well-being. And yet, a question lingers. If food, a basic human necessity, was so tightly regulated, how did ordinary people navigate daily hunger, scarcity, and market pressures without breaking the law? How much of medieval life revolved around compliance, and how much depended on quiet resistance, ingenuity, or negotiation in the margins of regulation? By the later medieval period, food regulation had become increasingly detailed and pervasive, reaching into nearly every aspect of production, sale, and consumption. You are no longer merely a consumer. Your daily choices are scrutinized by guild officials, town inspectors, and religious authorities. Eating had become a controlled activity, shaped by social, economic, and moral considerations, and compliance was enforced through observation, measurement, and communal expectation. Bakeries remained central to oversight. Loaves were weighed, ingredients inspected, and ovens monitored. Town-appointed bread weigher officers traveled through markets and streets, ensuring that bakers conformed to standardized measures. Even small deviations could trigger fines or public shaming. Bread, as the staple of the population, was symbolic as well as practical. Too little flour, too small a loaf, or poorly baked bread could be interpreted as negligence or corruption, threatening both subsistence and social order. Meat and fish markets operated under similarly strict scrutiny, but here, regulation was intertwined with religious observance. Laws mandated abstention from meat during fasts and feast days, while fish sellers adjusted supply to match demand. Market inspectors ensured compliance, and violations could be publicly punished. Fish became more than sustenance. It was an instrument of moral discipline, a visible reminder of authority and piety. Weights and measures were enforced rigorously. Grain, vegetables, and other staples were monitored for accuracy and quantity. Town authorities inspected scales, sometimes comparing them against standard reference weights. Merchants who attempted to cheat were fined, publicly humiliated, or temporarily banned from trade. Enforcement was not arbitrary. It was intended to stabilize commerce, maintain fairness, and protect the population from economic exploitation. You could see the hand of authority in every loaf of bread, barrel of ale, or sack of grain. Guilds maintained oversight of production and trade. Membership offered protection and opportunity, but also required strict adherence to rules. Apprentices were trained not only in craft techniques, but also in regulatory compliance. Breaches of rules, cutting corners, selling substandard goods, or failing to follow market timing could result in fines, expulsion, or public admonishment. These regulations were both protective and disciplinary, ensuring trust between producers, consumers, and the broader community. Storage and preservation were also regulated. Meat had to be properly salted or smoked, barrels of ale and wine monitored to prevent spoilage. These inspections, though primitive by modern standards, reflected an understanding that foodborne illness could devastate communities. Proper management of food was both a practical measure and a moral obligation. Failure could endanger life and provoke social unrest. Religious influence extended beyond fast days and feasts. Monasteries, often major producers and distributors of food, modeled strict standards that shaped surrounding towns. Pilgrims and travelers influenced local demand, forcing adjustments in production and sale. The interaction of religious guidance and civic enforcement created a complex system where morality, commerce, and social stability were intertwined with daily sustenance. Enforcement methods were often public, serving as lessons in compliance. Offenders might be paraded with symbolic punishment, publicly fined, or forced to correct the error before neighbors. These measures communicated expectations and reinforced communal norms. Public observation turned mundane food transactions into exercises in accountability and order, ensuring that law and custom remained inseparable from everyday life. Yet, despite strict regulation, the medieval population adapted. People found ways to work within or around the system. Barter networks, private arrangements, and creative substitutions allowed survival under scarcity. Smuggling and informal markets offered alternatives to official channels. Such actions highlight a tension between necessity and authority, Regulation sought to structure life, yet human ingenuity and need constantly tested its limits. This dynamic demonstrates that food in the Middle Ages was never purely about nutrition. It was a tool of governance, a marker of morality, and a foundation for social cohesion. Every meal, every purchase, every exchange carried layers of expectation. Compliance was necessary for safety and reputation, yet resistance and adaptation were essential for survival. And so, as you imagine the life of a medieval town, consider this: what you eat is never purely your own choice. The distribution, quality, and timing of food are embedded in systems of control, morality, and authority. How did ordinary people navigate hunger, scarcity, and opportunity without breaking rules that governed their most basic needs? How did they maintain agency under such pervasive oversight, balancing survival with compliance in a world that monitored even their daily meals? By the late medieval period, food regulation had become a cornerstone of social order. You can no longer view eating as a private instinctive act. It was a carefully monitored, socially and morally significant activity. Every loaf of bread, cut of meat, or barrel of ale reflected layers of authority, expectation and oversight. Compliance was a matter of survival, reputation, and communal stability. Bakers' guilds continued to enforce strict standards, ensuring that bread remained the staple of life and the benchmark of fairness. Markets thrived or faltered, depending on adherence to rules. Inspectors visited daily, weighing loaves, examining ovens, and recording infractions. A baker who attempted to cheat faced fines, public shaming, or expulsion from the guild. Bread, the most mundane of foods, became a symbol of order, trust, and community cohesion. Meat and fish remained subject to religious and civic regulation. Feast days, fasts, and holy observances shaped supply, demand, and consumption. Market inspectors enforced these rules, ensuring that religious expectations were met and that trade remained predictable. Fish sellers adjusted to these patterns, while authorities monitored storage and quality. Non-compliance was both a moral failing and a legal infraction. Consuming or selling forbidden foods could draw fines, social censure, or, in extreme cases, imprisonment. Eating was a moral as well as practical choice. Weights and measures governed trade rigorously. Grain, flour, and other staples were inspected, and scales calibrated to prevent deception. Merchants who cheated disrupted not only commerce but social trust. Punishments were public, reinforcing the expectation that food, as a shared necessity, must be distributed fairly. Observing these rules reinforced communal cohesion, creating a sense of reliability and predictability in daily life. Guilds reinforced these standards with layered oversight. Apprentices were trained in both production techniques and regulatory compliance. Masters ensured adherence to local rules, and non-compliance carried serious consequences. Authority and expertise were intertwined. Knowledge of craft, law, and social expectation was inseparable. The regulation of food became a form of governance, teaching citizens both responsibility and obedience. Despite pervasive oversight, ordinary people found ways to navigate scarcity, necessity, and opportunity. Informal markets, barter networks, and small acts of adaptation allowed survival. Smuggling, exchanging goods under the table, or substituting ingredients were not simply acts of defiance. They were practical responses to rigid systems and the realities of daily life. These adaptations highlight the dynamic tension between authority and human ingenuity. Regulation structured society, yet necessity shaped behavior. Religious influence remained deeply embedded. Monasteries, often centers of both production and education, set standards that towns emulated. Fast days, feast days, and ritual observances dictated consumption patterns. Pilgrims, travelers, and local populations interacted with these norms, reinforcing the moral, social, and economic function of food regulation. Eating was never private. It was observed, evaluated, and integrated into community life. Through all this, food became more than sustenance. It became a lens into medieval society. The regulation of daily meals reflected power, morality, and economic strategy. Compliance reinforced social cohesion. Resistance demonstrated human adaptability. Hunger, scarcity, and opportunity were negotiated within a framework that sought to maintain order, fairness, and stability, teaching citizens the limits and expectations of their world. And so, you are left with a reflection. The food you consume, the markets you visit, and the rules you follow are all shaped by centuries of governance and social expectation. In the medieval world, Every bite carried authority and moral significance. Even today, the systems of trust, measurement, and regulation that govern food echo the lessons learned centuries ago. How do you navigate rules that dictate your most basic needs, balancing survival with compliance, necessity with societal expectation? And perhaps, how much of modern life is still structured by these invisible patterns rooted in medieval oversight? When you imagine the Middle Ages, you might picture grimy streets, rough clothing, and people avoiding water whenever possible. Yet medieval towns often maintained public bathhouses, and these spaces were far more than places to wash. They were centers of social life, commerce, and sometimes moral concern. Every visit carried a complex interplay of hygiene, social hierarchy, and communal regulation. You were never just bathing, you were participating in a microcosm of society itself. Public baths existed in many medieval towns, inherited in part from Roman infrastructure. Cities like Paris, Cologne, and London maintained bathhouses that served residents across social classes. Although access varied depending on wealth, status, and gender, bathhouses were built near rivers, springs, or wells, with heated water provided by wood-fired systems or channeling from natural sources. The construction and maintenance of these facilities required technical skill, labor, and oversight, reflecting their importance to civic life. Bathing was structured, highly regulated, and often ritualized. Hours were assigned for different social groups or genders, ensuring order and propriety. Men and women typically bathed at separate times, though exceptions occurred in smaller towns. Nobles could afford private baths within their estates, while ordinary citizens relied on communal facilities. Guilds sometimes controlled access for their members, integrating hygiene into occupational responsibility. Attendance was not purely voluntary. Neglecting hygiene could carry social disapproval or legal scrutiny in some regions. You might expect bathhouses to be purely utilitarian, but they were far more than that. They functioned as social spaces, sites of business, and centers of information exchange. Merchants negotiated deals, apprentices learned etiquette, and travelers shared news from distant towns. Bathhouses also provided an opportunity for relaxation and entertainment. Small meals, music, and conversation often accompanied bathing. These establishments were simultaneously hygienic, commercial, and social hubs. Hygiene itself was understood in a complex, sometimes contradictory way. Physicians of the period recommended bathing for health, linking clean skin to vitality and resistance to disease. Yet concerns about overexposure, sexual impropriety, or moral decay led authorities to monitor bathing behavior. Clergy sometimes preached caution, warning that bathhouses could become sites of temptation, particularly when men and women might interact. Public oversight was subtle but persistent, blending moral guidance with civic regulation. Economic activity within bathhouses was significant. Attendants, bakers, and vendors provided goods and services. Bathing required fees, firewood, and maintenance, creating livelihoods and integrating the facilities into local economies. Guilds and municipal authorities profited indirectly by monitoring compliance, collecting fees, and regulating behavior. The bathhouse was a point of convergence, economic, social, and sanitary systems intertwined in one physical space. Disease and sanitation concerns were central to regulation. While many bathhouses were clean by contemporary standards, they could also be sites of contagion if poorly maintained. Local authorities issued mandates for water replacement, cleanliness, and the removal of waste. Inspections ensured that facilities met basic standards, demonstrating an early recognition that communal hygiene was vital to public health. Failure to maintain proper practices could result in fines, closure, or social censure. Social hierarchy was visibly reinforced in these spaces. Nobles might access private chambers, whereas commoners shared communal pools. Attendants enforced etiquette, ensuring that interactions conformed to social norms. The bathhouse, though ostensibly egalitarian in promoting hygiene, reflected the stratified society it served. Your place in the bath was a reflection of your place in the broader town. Yet, despite regulation, bathhouses were sites of improvisation and negotiation. Patrons sometimes circumvented rules, arranged private visits, or engaged in discreet social interactions. These deviations highlight the tension between authority and personal desire. The bathhouse was both controlled and contested space. People learned to navigate these complexities, balancing social expectation with personal needs. By examining medieval public baths, you see how hygiene, commerce, morality, and social life converged in a single location. Bathing was not a private ritual, but a regulated, socially embedded act. It required compliance with civic and religious norms, while also offering opportunity for interaction, trade, and personal care. Cleanliness, order, and observation were inseparable. And yet, a question remains: in a world where bathing was monitored, stratified, and morally charged, how did ordinary people experience privacy, comfort, and autonomy? How did they negotiate the tension between regulation and personal need in a space meant to cleanse both body and social status? As medieval public baths became more established, their role in daily life expanded beyond cleanliness into commerce, social networking, and even civic surveillance. You are not simply entering a pool of warm water, you are stepping into a carefully regulated environment, one that blends hygiene, economic opportunity, and social expectation. The bathhouse is both a microcosm of society and a tool for enforcing order, revealing how daily routines were subtly structured by authority. Bathing schedules were tightly controlled. Town authorities, guilds, and bathhouse owners assigned specific hours for different groups: men, women, children, and sometimes apprentices or officials. These divisions ensured propriety and minimized conflict, but they also reinforced social hierarchies. Nobility or wealthy merchants might enjoy private hours or exclusive chambers, while commoners relied on communal pools. Access was rarely equal, and your position in the schedule was a reflection of status, privilege, and compliance with local rules. Economic activity within bathhouses was intertwined with these social regulations. Attendants managed bathing areas, collected fees, and maintained supplies. Vendors sold food, herbs, oils, and other amenities, turning hygiene into a business opportunity. Services like massage, hairdressing, or minor medical treatments often accompanied bathing, creating a multifunctional environment where daily life, commerce, and care overlapped. The bathhouse was a hub where physical cleanliness and economic exchange met under careful oversight. Guilds and civic authorities exercised influence in subtle ways. Guilds sometimes restricted access to members or ensured that apprentices understood proper etiquette and hygiene. Town officials monitored water quality, maintenance, and safety, issuing fines or warnings for negligence. Religious authorities occasionally intervened, discouraging excessive indulgence or morally suspect interactions. This layered oversight made the bathhouse a carefully policed space where order and morality were enforced alongside cleanliness. Hygiene itself was a subject of both practicality and debate. Physicians recommended bathing to prevent disease, improve circulation, and maintain general health. At the same time, concerns about excessive bathing, believed to weaken the body or invite moral corruption, led to rules about frequency and duration. Bathing was a calculated activity, balancing benefit and risk. Citizens learned to navigate these recommendations, adhering to standards without exceeding them, mindful of both health and social expectation. Social interaction in bathhouses was highly structured yet flexible. While communal bathing encouraged conversation, exchange of news and business dealings, attendants and supervisors enforced boundaries. Gossip, negotiation, and rumor circulated alongside relaxation, making the bathhouse a vital channel of information and influence. You could learn about market prices, political developments, or personal reputations, all while immersed in warm water. Observation by others ensured that behavior remained within acceptable norms, blending social oversight with personal experience. The public bath was also a space of adaptation. Patrons found ways to negotiate privacy and autonomy within communal settings. Screens, partitioned areas, and staggered schedules offered modest relief from constant observation. Individuals adjusted bathing times or routines to suit personal needs, balancing social expectation with practical necessity. These adaptations reveal the interplay between control and agency. Authority structured the space, but users found ways to exert choice within those boundaries. Regulation extended to maintenance and safety. Water quality, temperature, and cleanliness were monitored, and violations could result in fines or closure. Bathhouses were often subject to civic inspection, reflecting a growing awareness of communal responsibility for health. The practices you observe, clean water, proper heating, removal of waste, are not mere convenience but essential to the function of the bath as a safe communal space. Neglect could endanger many, demonstrating the communal stakes of personal hygiene. Even as bathhouses became more common, moral concerns persisted. Kalaji cautioned against temptation, reminding citizens that shared spaces could foster immoral behavior. Yet the necessity of hygiene, coupled with social opportunity, ensured that bathhouses remained central to urban life. Citizens learned to navigate the tension between public oversight, moral expectation, and personal need, balancing propriety with practicality. By examining these practices, it becomes clear that medieval bathhouses were far more than facilities for washing. They were regulated social arenas, where hygiene, commerce, morality, and civic oversight intersected. Every visit reinforced social norms, economic interaction, and communal responsibility. Bathing was never merely personal, it was a negotiated act of participation in society itself. And so, you are left to wonder, if bathing was both essential and surveilled, how did people manage privacy, comfort, and social connection? How did they experience autonomy within a system designed to control behavior, enforce morality, and maintain order? How much of the modern understanding of hygiene, social etiquette, and shared responsibility traces back to these carefully monitored medieval spaces? By the later Middle Ages, public bathhouses had evolved into institutions that were simultaneously practical, social, and moral. You are no longer simply entering a pool of warm water. You are participating in a microcosm of medieval society, one carefully structured to balance hygiene, commerce, observation, and social control. Bathing had become a complex act, regulated and layered with meaning. Economic and social life continued to intertwine within the bathhouse. Attendants collected fees, ensured order, and maintained the facility, while vendors provided food, oils, herbs, and minor medical treatments. Bathing was both service and commerce. You might negotiate a business deal, exchange news, or learn of market conditions while immersed in warm water. These spaces were crucial hubs of information and networking, far beyond their role in cleanliness. In essence, bathing was a conduit for both bodily and social upkeep. Guilds and municipal authorities retained oversight. Bathhouse workers were trained not only in hygiene but in etiquette, surveillance, and enforcement. Violations of rules, such as exceeding allotted times, ignoring gender divisions, or engaging in morally questionable behavior, could result in fines, expulsion, or public reprimand. Religious authorities occasionally issued warnings or guidance, cautioning against temptation and excessive indulgence. The bathhouse was, therefore, a stage where civic, moral, and social norms were performed and reinforced. Hygiene practices themselves were informed by both medical theory and communal expectation. Physicians advised bathing to prevent disease, improve circulation, and maintain overall health. Yet excessive bathing was discouraged, reflecting a belief that too much water could weaken the body. You were taught to balance health benefits with moral propriety and social expectation. Bathing was never purely private. It was an activity governed by knowledge, observation, and custom. Social interaction within bathhouses was carefully negotiated. While communal spaces encouraged conversation, gossip, and networking, attendance ensured boundaries were respected. Privacy was partial and managed through staggered schedules, screens, and partitioned areas. The tension between supervision and autonomy shaped behavior, teaching patrons how to navigate social hierarchies and communal expectations. You learned to assert modesty while participating in a shared experience, a lesson in balance between individuality and societal norms. Bathhouses also reflected broader societal structures. Nobles or wealthy merchants might access private chambers, while commoners shared pools. Access and experience mirrored social rank, and every interaction was observed. The bathhouse, though ostensibly egalitarian in promoting cleanliness, reinforced the stratified society it served. Your position within it was a measure of both privilege and compliance with civic and moral expectations. Despite regulation, people adapted. Small acts of negotiation, adjusting schedules, arranging private sessions, or exchanging favors, allowed patrons to navigate the rules while maintaining dignity, comfort, and social connection. These adaptations illustrate how authority and human ingenuity coexisted. Regulation imposed structure, yet users shaped their own experiences within it. The bathhouse became a site of negotiation, teaching lessons about agency, compliance, and adaptability. Ultimately, medieval public baths reveal how daily life was structured by overlapping systems of hygiene, morality, commerce, and observation. Cleanliness was not merely a personal concern, it was a civic, social, and moral responsibility. Every bath reinforced communal norms, economic systems, and societal hierarchy. These institutions cultivated not only physical health, but social awareness, teaching citizens to navigate authority, expectation, and interpersonal interaction simultaneously. And so, you are left with a lingering thought. The simple act of washing was never truly private in the medieval world. Each dip into warm water carried lessons in social behavior, moral compliance, and civic responsibility. How much of our modern notions of hygiene, privacy, and social etiquette are inherited from these centuries-old practices? How deeply does the structure of shared spaces influence the way you interact with others even today?